thank you for joining us. As I opened with at the start, we have a great panel of presenters with us tonight. The idea of the Young Geographers Forum is to bring together young researchers, whether they be PhD, masters, honours, undergraduate, to present to our membership, both young and old, about their work and how they're going, and a bit of a story of their journey through geography so far. We're going to start tonight with a 15-minute or so overview from each of our speakers and then dive into a panel discussion there at the end. With us tonight, our first speaker will be Nguyen, who'll share her work from her recent PhD at the University of Tasmania, which investigates the factors behind plant biodiversity in forests underlain by volcanic bedrock in Eastern Australia. Her research aims to unravel the factors contributing to the distribution and unique biota of these forests, revealing the intricate interplay of geology, soil, and climate that shapes these biodiverse ecosystems. Our second speaker is Dylan Cowley, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of the Environment, the recent rename at University of Queensland. His research focuses on the interaction between coastal geomorphology and oceanographic processes, and how these interactions change over multiple decades, utilising land and sea observations and numerical models. And lastly, online, our final speaker is Olivier Decitre. You're going to have to correct me, I'm so sorry. Who is an inspiring marine biologist and nature photographer, completing a Masters of Marine Biology at James Cook University. His research focuses on streamlining deep learning object detection algorithms for conservationists and ecologists, transforming complex data labels into user-friendly maps and actionable insights for real-world applications. He's utilising drone imagery from the Great Barrier Reef, and his research specifically focuses on the detection and mapping of giant clams. With that, we'll dive into our first presentation, which is Annie.
Thanks, John. So I am Annie, and doing my PhD, still doing my PhD at the University of Tasmania. I am funded by the Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage to look at volcanic forests in Eastern Australia. So what's a volcanic forest? It's a made-up term that I made, actually. So let's break it down. The forest part is quite easy, right? It's basically anything I can wrap my arms around. So I'm looking at vascular plants in Eastern Australia. And so that the contrasting side of that is I don't look at montane grasslands because there's just so few of them to compare with each other. So I'm only looking at forests. And the volcanic part of volcanic forest is a little bit harder. The volcanic side of things, when people think of volcanic, they might think of granite, which is a misconception because it's plutonic. So it's basically an intrusive rock. So magma, when it rises towards the surface, if it doesn't get exposed at the surface, it's plutonic. It's not technically volcanic. The volcanic term strictly refers to when magma exposes at the surface, it becomes lava and cools at the surface to become volcanic material. So when I say volcanic forest, I mean anything that is in the basaltic to rhyolitic range. All I want you to take away from this is essentially basalt is about 50% silica, and rhyolitic material or the felsic material goes up to about 70% silica. A great example of this is you can see it at Purlingbrook Falls, just in Springbok National Park. It's about an hour and a half walk. At the bottom of the waterfall, you see the basalt, and then a little bit further up, as it gets more silica content, it becomes a lot lighter in color, and that's the felsic material transitioning, so the more silica content is coming through there. So volcanic forest then is a forest that is on volcanic bedrock. So you can see there's the forest on top there, and I'm interested in everything underneath as well. So a long time ago, Australia used to be connected to Antarctica, and then we drifted away. And when we drifted away, there's this geological theory where we're proposed to have moved over a volcanic hotspot. So a volcanic hotspot stays in one place on the Earth's surface, and it has its source deep within the mantle, and it's the continental plate that moves over the volcanic hotspot. And when the continental plate moves over it, it has its surface expression as volcanoes along the east coast of Australia. So anywhere along here where we see volcanic activity that's about 110 kilometers in depth or less, basically. So it moved over Queensland around about 30 million years ago, and then into New South Wales about 20 million years ago. And right now it's proposed to be within the Bass Basin. I need to stress that this is still a theory. It's still being debated today. I'm not interested in how these volcanoes formed. I'm interested in the forests that are on those volcanoes. So my thesis question was basically, are Eastern Australia's volcanic forests biodiversity hotspots? Do they have more species on them compared to sites that aren't on volcanic lithology? A number of potential factors that I use as variables include elevation, climate, I use soil variables, there's geographic location, geology, and there's a whole bunch of other biotic factors that I put into my model. But firstly, I've got to gather some data, right? I started my thesis in March 2020, bang on when we decided to close the border. And I put in a permit for about 150 sites, and something that should have taken about 30 to 60 days took me a year and a half. So a year and a half, that's half of my PhD gone. So I only managed to get about 20, 22, 23 sites or so. I had to gather the rest of the data from state databases. That was it's about 3 million, and then I had to clean the data. And it's important to stress that there's about 7,500 species, but that's only vascular plants. So vascular plants means that I'm not looking at moss, I'm not looking at fungi, I'm not looking at liverboards because they're too hard to systematically count in the field. And so my first question was basically, is there more species richness on the volcanic forest compared to the not on volcanic forest? So I had a number of sites that are volcanic, and then I had a similar pair at the same elevation within its rough vicinity of 1 degree lat or long. And to do that, I'm going to bombard you with a lot of maths. The first thing I did was I tried to see how similar the sites are. I calculated the Jacquard similarity. That just basically means if you've got site A and site B and you overlap the number of species that are the same in that site, that's the percentage that it is similar in. So if you've got 2 species, you've got 0.5% similarity. And a great way to visualize the similarity is in a dendrogram tree. So a dendrogram is basically just like a tree. And then if you've got a bunch of branches that are on this side and they're closer together, that means they're more similar. And then if you've got on another branch, extremely different species in different sites compared to the branches over here, that means they're very different. And what I want you to take away from this is just for New South Wales. I couldn't fit the whole of the East Coast on one dendrogram. But what I wanted you to take away from this is that sites that are the same color are the same lithology. And so we are seeing that species that occur within a site prefer specific volcanic lithology types. And that's where you get this clustering of colors because of the volcanic type beneath the sites. So I permutate the data. I have this data set, and then I permutate it 1,000 times, and then I compare it to my null model, and I say, how likely is my data likely to occur by chance? Luckily for me, it's a very small number. So the more asterisks there is, the more unlikely for it to occur by chance. So this is my not on volcanic lithology, that's my baseline. And then everything else, this goes from the mafic to the felsic. So if you remember, that's about 50% silica, or about 70% silica. And so there's statistical, really, really unlikely chance that the mafic site compared to the not on volcanic lithology. It's very, very low in species richness compared to not on volcanic lithology. and it's very unlikely that that's by chance. Compared to felsic material on the other end, we see that it has a little bit less significance because they don't have enough data points, and that's because of the way that the volcanoes form. So geologically, it's not natural for felsic material in Eastern Australia because of the way the geology is. So I had to use some different felsic, and this is where the granite comes in, because basically I needed to compare the felsic with the mafic, but I didn't have enough extrusive material, so I started using plutonic material. What I want you to take away from this is basically the volcanic forest does have a statistically significant difference. So the volcano and the lithology underneath these forests are statistically different, but it depends on the type of lithology, whether or not there's more or less species. So my next question was, what about the lithology is driving species richness? And to do that, I had to use a random forest model. The best way to explain a random forest model, if you remember in the 90s when I was growing up, we played this game called Guess Who. And the aim of the game is to try to guess who the other person is, right? And you have to ask a yes/no question. You have to ask them, like, do you have brown eyes? Do you have glasses? Do you have a hat, and so forth? So those are all variables that you can use to try to predict the other person. In the same way, random forest models try to predict how much species richness there is within a site. So if I said, how many species are there in Lamington? It tries to predict that with a bunch of species, climatic variables, soil variables, and so forth that I put into it before. And then you can do this a ridiculously large amount of times. And then at the end of it, you tell it, okay, now learn from your mistakes and do it again, all over again. So it does it a lot of times. And if you remember when you were younger, when you played the game, there are questions that you can ask that are more powerful than other questions, right? So if you get to go first and you ask, do you have brown eyes? That only knocks off about 3 or 4 different characters, right? And then you've still got about 25 other characters that you've got to guess. But if you get to go first and you ask, are you female or are you male? That's a more powerful question, right? Because you knock off half the characters on the board straight away. And that variable, are you male or are you female, is a really important predictor of that person, the other person that you're trying to guess. And that's the variable that I want to know. It's the variable that goes in the root node every single time. So it's in the random forest model, it's called variable importance because it's an important variable. So I'm trying to predict species richness. If I gave it a park, I want to know, is it a species rich park or is it a species poor park? And the way that I did that was by making 5,000 decision trees and then telling it to learn from its mistake and then redo those trees again and then give me the model. And then tell me what are the most important variables. So these are the questions that you want to ask at the top, right at the very start, right? So the first variable, the most important variable it gave was log of area, which makes absolute sense, right? If I've got a 1 by 1 meter square, might fit one tree, might fit an orchid, a tree and an orchid, 1 by 1, not a lot of species. And then if I've got 10 by 10, instantly, so many more species, right? But the relationship between area and species richness is not linear, it's not straightforward, it's on a log scale, hence the log of area. The next most important variable is terrain ruggedness index maximum value. It's a mouthful. It basically means how likely am I going to roll my ankle if I walk through this landscape, all right? So if I've got this very fat, flat, so if I've got, even if I've got a high in elevation site, if it's quite flat, I'm not really going to get that many species. But if I've got, FIPM range, that's my elevation. So the elevation and terrain ruggedness are quite closely related. So if I've got a site where it's quite high or low in elevation, there's a big difference in the range of the minimum and the maximum of the elevation. And then in between that, if I'm likely to roll my ankle, I'm likely to see a lot of species. And then the next thing I wanted to know was composition. What was driving all of those species to occur and cluster together? So remember, we saw all those purple sites clustered together. That basically means species are preferring a specific type of volcanic lithology. So what's driving that composition? I probably don't have time to go into partial canonical correspondence analysis, another mouthful. But what I want you to take away from this is basically, this is a two-dimensional graph of a nth dimensional. So I've got 73 variables, so it's 73 dimensions. But basically, I want you to look at the VC, that's volcanic complex. So what I'm seeing is that in Tasmania and in Eastern Victoria, I'm seeing sites, these basaltic sites, these are the colors. So I'm seeing these basaltic sites and a number of species that are preferring these basaltic sites within these southern complexes. They're driven by precipitation of the coldest quarter, so precipitation in winter. Whereas if you look over here, if you're familiar with the Undera volcanoes, just north of, just south of Clams, a little bit inland. Okay. So this region here, you know, so compared to this region here where it's driven by precipitation in winter, over here we have a completely different complex, and that's driven by completely different variables. And that is driven by temperature seasonality. So the more that the temperature swings between summer and winter, the more it has an influence on species richness. And so what I want you to take from this is basically you can't, if anyone says that one single variable is the predictor of species richness, just point at their face and be like, no, you're lying. Because it's very, very complex and it varies a lot by where the complex is. Because the take-home message is essentially, if you need to conserve an area, conserve a very large area. So the bigger, the better, right? Try to conserve a highly rugged area. The third thing that was on the machine learning model was the depth of soil and basically a high number of stratigraphic units. Sorry, I panicked and then forgot about that. But essentially try to conserve a complex environment for species. Because you didn't fall asleep in my math, you get some beautiful fieldwork photos. So that's Glasshouse Mountains, and then we've got central Tasmania, and then Nguyen, that's the granite, that's the different felsic that I used as felsic. I do have a lot of people to thank for this. It takes an entire community to raise a PhD. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. A really fascinating presentation, and I think I now understand more where those GIS questions were coming from a few weeks ago. Maybe. That brings us on now to our second presenter of the evening, Dylan.
So I don't have my name and everything on here, less words, hopefully some more pretty pictures and things that we can look at. That's the idea, at least, when you're talking about beaches and things like that. But I'll try and go through maybe some of the broader concepts of what I've done throughout my PhD and what I've been doing since then in terms of this central model here. So this is kind of the central concept for the field that we call coastal morphodynamics. So maybe a bit of a long word, but it's this combination between morphology at the top, so the shape of the coast and how that affects processes like waves and wind, so the dynamics and the processes that we see, and how those wave and wind processes then affect sediment transport and how that affects the shape of the coast. So there's this positive feedback model between each of these processes that give us our understanding of coastal morphodynamics and how all of these things shape the coast and why it is the way that we see it today. So trying to pull these things out separately and identify them and look at trends through time and space and try and understand them on their own can be a little bit tricky. So we usually try and incorporate them all together to get a better idea of how they all interact through both time and space. So what I've been doing is looking at each of these things across the coast of Queensland for the past few years. So here are some nice pretty pictures from North Stradbroke Island. If any of you have been over there, it's a very nice place to go. So these are all of photos of Main Beach, so on the eastern coast of the island. So it's a beautiful place to go, and it's a really interesting system. It's a very long beach, so about 40 kilometres long. Not something that we see a lot of around Queensland, so we have a lot of smaller beaches in places. But on these large sand islands, so like North Stradbroke and Fraser, we see these really large kind of beaches. So these are really cool and really interesting, but they present some problems when we're trying to investigate these and make observations over long periods of time. We're not going to send someone out like myself to survey this every month because it would take a month to survey the thing. So we need to think of some other approaches that we can use to analyze these things over larger spatial and temporal scales. So instead of going out and spending a lot of time on the beach, we look at old photos instead, which is fun in and of itself, but of course it is nice to be out on the beach sometimes. So what I've been doing is utilising some old aerial photos that we have for Queensland. So we have a really large collection of these aerial photos, which I'm sure you can talk to John about afterwards as well. But these are a really useful resource for us. If we use things like satellite imagery, which we've been utilising as well, we can only go back so far. So about the 1980s, right, when satellites were first sort of implemented for large-scale monitoring. These photos can go back a lot older. Some of the older ones we've been using for these studies go back to about 1930. So that's almost 100 years of observations we can make on the coast for these sorts of things. So that's really cool. We haven't utilised these so much in the past. There's a lot to do to deal with these kinds of photos. A lot of manual work went into trying to georeference these and correct things and then draw the shorelines along each of these sections of coast. So that's a nice example there of some of the features you can see. So you can see, maybe you can see those bumpy straight lines on the coast there. So this is what we call a strand plane. So those are old shorelines and old beaches from sort of the Holocene, so over the past 10,000 years. We see a lot of these things up and down the coast, and there's been quite a lot of study going into sort of the ages of these and how fast they move over that time frame. The time frame I'm more interested in is over the past few decades or over the past century. That's more of a time frame that we can kind of wrap our heads around, right? A lot of us, have lived over the past few decades, maybe a little bit longer, but it's more the time frame that we're used to trying to look into the future with as well, right? So we're concerned with what's going to happen in the next 10 or the next 20 years. It can be a little bit more difficult to try and make decisions or make predictions for further than that, so the next 1,000 years or the next 100 years. So these aerial photos in themselves here can be quite useful. Again, you can see some of these strand planes here, but we can see all different kinds of features within these. The key thing that we're looking for here, though, to try and get an idea of the shape of the coast and how much sediment is moving around and how waves interact with the shoreline, is that shoreline itself. So that thin strip of sand that we see just past the trees there. So that's what we're trying to pull out of these different photos here, is that the position of that shoreline through time. That's what we're really interested in. So a nice example here again from North Stradbroke Island. So this is the eastern part of Amity, if anybody's been over there as well. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to pull from these photos. We can see where the trees end, we can see where the shoreline meets the sea, and we can get an idea of how much sand is in that thin strip there. Okay, that's the part that we're usually interested in. When you go down to the beach, you're not walking around in the trees, maybe you're swimming in the water, but you're really interested in that thin strip of sand, right? So that's what we've been trying to track. And with these aerial photos and some satellite imagery, we've been able to do that. So we can see some really interesting changes like what we've got here. Okay, so we can see that the beach has moved further out to sea, but it's also been getting smaller. So when we first saw these things over this period, we had some questions like, how can this be possible? If the beach is moving further out to sea, then we need enough sand coming in to allow that sort of growth. But if the beach has been getting smaller at the same time, then why is that? Do we have lots of trees growing? Are we starting to get less sediment coming in? Is it a sea level question? And those are the sorts of things that we're trying to answer over the past few years. So to do that, we need to get a bit of an understanding about the processes that shape these kinds of beaches. So of course, sediment moving around is very important, but most of what drives the sediment transport we see in Queensland and generally around the world in these sandy environments are waves and winds. So for the most part, we tend to look at waves because the winds usually drive the waves that we're interested in. So if we could just look at the wave processes, we can have more of an idea of the potential the sediment to move around and how much there might be, and really where it's going, because that's what we're interested in. So there's a couple of different ways we can do that. Over a large scale, it can be a little bit difficult to get reliable observations. We don't have 1,000 buoys out on the coast measuring waves all the time. Thankfully, in Queensland, we do have a large number. So we've got about 13 buoys that have been operational since the mid-1970s, and we have about 50 more that have been operational here and there across that period. So a few months here, a few months there, and that sort of thing. So they give us some really valuable observations that we can use to get more of an idea about what's going on at the coast. In lieu of having lots and lots of observations to fill in the gaps between those buoys, we use numerical models. So we can get an idea of what's going on with the waves over a larger scale. So that's what you can see on the right over here, just a small example of some of our results from around Cairns. So we can get some really high spatial resolution results, so we can get an idea of what's going on at really fine parts of the coast there. So the key thing here we need is, if we run a model, we get some waves out at the end, that's great, but how do we know if they're correct? That's what we can use these buoys for. We can use the buoys to try and check, to make sure their models are reasonable, and that the numbers we're getting out for waves and things like that make sense, right? So if we get 20-meter waves at the coast and we've got no way to check it, probably know that's not true, but we've got no real way to check it. With these buoys, we have a great way to make sure that those numbers make sense. So once we have those sorts of things, we can make pretty pictures like this with a bunch of arrows. Not very nice on the eyes, but it does get the message across. So this is where we can try and get an idea of sediment transport. So how much sediment is moving up and down the coast. What we're really interested in here is the volume of it, obviously, but also where it's going. So whether it's moving north, whether it's moving south, where it might be coming from and where it might be going in the end. If it's being deposited on a particular beach, if it's being lost offshore, those are the kinds of questions that we want to answer. So for the most part in Queensland, in southeast Queensland at least, most of the sand moves from south to north. The southeasterly wave climate that we have drives the transport, and things tend to move up the coast. When you get to the tip of Fraser Island, they sort of just disappears off the edge of the continental shelf. So that question there we have is, where is the sediment coming from for the beaches north of Fraser Island? Right. So we have a few ideas, but it's quite difficult to quantify that sort of thing. So the images I showed before was from beaches north of Fraser Island. Okay, so they were, one of them was near the Fitzroy River mouth, which is kind of an important spot in terms of when we're looking for where this sediment comes from. So the idea we have there is a lot of this sediment is coming from rivers and those sorts of things, but the amount of sediment we have coming out of these rivers and the size of it that we see doesn't really account for all of the change that we've seen over the long term. So that sand has to be coming from somewhere else. So we need to try and work out where that is. And that's where this picture on the left over here comes in. We try and build a broader idea of where sediment comes from, where it goes to, and try and identify all of the sources of sediment and all of the sinks, so where it ends up. In practical sense, though, it's not really possible to identify every single one of those sources and account for them and properly quantify them through both space and time. So we usually try and simplify this. We just look at how much sediment's coming in and how much sediment is going out of a beach or a particular coastal area. Right? So rather than try and get all these different details here. So once we look at those three things, we need to try and think a little bit broader. So if we're looking at that sediment budget approach, we're looking at how much sediment is coming in and how much is coming out, that sort of lies outside of that initial coastal morphodynamics model. So first of all, we're just looking at the interaction between waves and sand, how it moves around, but now we need to look at where it's all coming from and how much is coming in and how that changes through time. So that's when we start looking at things like external forces, so outside this beach system. So one thing that we consider, and one thing that's considered very often and a lot these days, is changes in sea level. Right, so over the past 100 years or so, we've had about 20 centimetres of sea level rise in Queensland. And if we were just looking at that aspect alone, we would expect our beaches to recede, so move more towards the land. As sea levels go up, it pushes that sand back and we lose our beaches. But from the picture I showed you before on Flinders Beach, on the eastern side of Amity there, that's not happening. So at the sites we've been studying, seems to be fairly consistent in terms of accretion over the past 100 years. There's some localized erosion in places, but on the broader scale over that century, there has been a noticeable amount of beach progradations moving out towards the sea. So we need to try and work out why that is. Again, if we're just looking at sea level, we wouldn't expect that kind of result. So what we need to do, and what we've been doing, is trying to get a better idea of this supply of sediment. So where has this sand been coming from? If we're seeing all of this accretion through time, it has to be coming from somewhere. So one answer is beaches. Another answer is, not beaches. One answer is rivers. Another answer is people have been dumping a lot of sand on the coast. They have been in places like the Gold Coast, but on a broader scale across Queensland, that's not entirely true. So one answer we have at the moment is there's a lot of sediment stored on the continental shelf. So when sea levels were lower over the past 10,000 years, the shoreline was further out to sea, and rivers that were active during that time were depositing sediment onto the continental shelf. So there is some evidence of that sort of thing happening, especially in Keppel Bay, so at the mouth of the Fitzroy. We look at the old tracks of the river across the continental shelf, we can see large deposits of sediment. So as we get large wave events, cyclones and things like that, that sediment can be picked up and pushed towards the coast. So there's a lot of sand on the shelf that allows for these coastal areas to keep growing, even under things like sea level rise, which is very interesting. We haven't seen a lot of that across the world, but I'll just point out a nice example here. So again, this is on North Stradbroke Island, where we've done a lot of work. So this is the eastern end of Flinders Beach, if anyone's been over there. It's near a campsite, so this is a road just getting out onto the beach. There's a campsite just behind it, but clearly at this point it's closed off and it looks like there's a bit of an erosion problem, right? So this is in November of 2017. So if we come back to the same site, slightly different angle of the photo, this is April of the following year. So that's only about 5 months, and that's a lot of change in this particular location. Clearly there's no erosion problem here at this point in time, and that's a lot of sediment to just appear in those last 5 months. So that's what we see in southeast Queensland. There's a lot of sand moving up and down the coast. I know this number doesn't mean a lot to anyone, but about 1 million cubic meters can move up the coast in a particular year. I can't picture that kind of number, but it's quite a lot. So that's the kind of things we have driving these systems over these kinds of timescales. So if this is just happening over 5 months, just imagine what's going on over the course of 100 years, right? So this isn't all accumulating over the course of that 100 years. It tends to come in pulses, but this can keep the beaches in a relatively healthy state. Okay? So it's good to try and understand these things and know where this sediment's coming from and know when it might not appear. So then we can actually make proper decisions and well-informed decisions about how to manage the coast. So instead of dumping millions of cubic meters of sediment onto the coast when you see a lot of erosion, things might return to normal gradually through time. Of course, we don't always have that luxury. If there's a lot of houses on this section of the coast, then obviously we need to try and do something to mitigate erosion. But there is a natural cycle going on here. And we need to understand where this sand is coming from to better manage these kinds of systems. So just a couple of examples here that I always like to point out. So this is the mouth of the Maroochy River up on the Sunshine Coast, but the variability here as well is really interesting to see. So on the left, we have an image from 1958, where we can see the mouth of the river is pouring out to the south of this little island. So this little rock here is Pincushion Island, I think it's called, but the mouth of the river is to the south of that. In 1974, it's to the north, and in 2020, it's back to the south. So there's a lot of variation here in where the sediment's going, where it's ending up after it finishes moving, and all those kinds of things. Okay. So making big decisions about where things go in terms of large caravan parks, and then we have to try and protect when things change back to how they were, or if we just have a natural cycle over a long period. So if we have a long record and we have a better idea of what's going on, we can plan things a little bit more easily. On the other side of things, this is Coolangatta Beach on the Gold Coast. This, I would say, is not really a very natural system. So again, there's lots of growth here and the shoreline has moved very far out to sea, but there's a lot of management going on here. There's a lot of work put in to try and maintain the beach, make it a little bit bigger, and make it very tourist friendly and all that kind of thing. So it's a very different kind of system. But again, we need to have a bit of an idea of what's going on so we can maybe avoid this kind of thing if we need to, if we don't want to keep things growing and growing, and try and maintain things as they are. So last example here, which I like to use is, this is the Gold Coast. The image on the left, I think it's covered from the top so you guys can't see it, but is from 1930. And the one in the middle is 1984, I think, and then 2007 on the right-hand side. So again, there's a lot of development going on here. You can see from these photos. I just love to use this one as an example. And that's not something we can capture in satellite images. The satellite images go back to the middle photo here. So they don't go any older than that. But if we have all these aerial photos, we can go back into the 1930s on the left, and we can see how things were 100 years ago. In the case here, relatively stable. There hasn't been a lot of change on the Gold Coast, but it has been heavily managed throughout most of its history. So it's kind of a different example, but it is a nice one to show with all the buildings there. So, but that's the summary of what we've been doing over the past few years, trying to get an understanding of all these processes and how they interact in both time and space, so we can get a better idea of how to manage these things into the future.
Thank you, Dylan. Really fascinating. It's great to see the aerial photography collection getting well used. Done too much work with that data set to see it languish.
It's a big data.
Only gets bigger.
Yeah.
Okay, that now brings us on to our final presenter for tonight. Olivier, I will throw to you.
Yep, everyone. My name is Olivier. I'm a French international master's student at James Cook University. I'm really passionate about marine environments with a special interest in coral reef ecosystems. Just for a little bit of backstory, as a kid, I always envisioned myself being more of a marine biologist and an ecologist. I always thought I'd be studying alongside animals in their natural habitats. But as I journeyed through my studies, I realized for different reasons that this path actually wasn't quite for me. Fortunately, though, in parallel, I've begun to develop quite an interest in GIS, and I took Karen Joyce's course in remote sensing up in Cairns, and that actually really reignited a love and a new spark within me for this field. I was really drawn to how we can visually present data through remote sensing rather than the complex statistical models that we usually use in ecology. I was really lucky enough to have her have Karen as my supervisor for my research project. And I'm actually really excited to be sharing some of the work that I've been conducting for the past few months with you all today. Just as a side note, in 1 month's time, I'll be having to present my work for the completion of my master's in a presentation similar to this. So if you have any type of feedback, I would greatly appreciate it. Before we start talking about the clams that I've been studying, I wanted to briefly talk about this study by Drever et al. From 2015. So similar to other research monitoring a species in the wild, this team flew drones to monitor and count wintering birds in British Columbia. And with the advancement of drones and that technology, researchers now can really operate with a heightened efficiency, no longer requiring to laboriously track through the field on foot, or in this case, having to wade through these muddy waters. Not only does this save a lot of time, it also allows access to really remote areas with also minimal disturbances to the wildlife. However, once the imagery was collected, it's then stitched together into these very large images called orthomosaics that you can see on the side here. And then the researchers actually had to manually go through this image and individually count the total number of birds. And in this case, they counted a total of about 18,000 birds, which, just for reference, 18,000 seconds is about 5 to 6 hours. So it's quite a long time. And while this study was done in 2015, just this morning I was speaking to my supervisor and she told me of a project that counted 70,000 birds on an island on the Great Barrier Reef. So it's really not practical, it takes quite a lot of time. And there's surely things we can do. And instead of manually processing such vast amount of data, we can now leverage artificial intelligence to streamline this process and make it more efficient. And more conservation research uses these tools for varied object recognition tasks. Some use it to detect dead trees in forests from drone imagery, to even spotting whales from satellite imagery. So it's really, really neat. But while AI can bring significant advantages in conservation work, it definitely has many challenges. And I'll now be sharing some of the specific problems I attempted to tackle with my research. So I'm going to be going some of the problems that I encountered using AI algorithms and drone imagery, but I'm also going to show you how you can use these tools to analyze such vast amount of data. For my case study, I chose to monitor giant clams. These are an endangered species in many areas in the Indo-Pacific. And there are some efforts to conserve them, but these often lack a standardized protocol to monitor them. And I thought that pairing drone imagery with an AI that could automatically detect them would be really helpful as an addition to these protocols. So my study addressed three main problems that I'm going to go through. The first one was focused on being able to apply these algorithms to really large images. Some of these images weigh a couple gigabytes just themselves. And I wanted to be able to apply these algorithms to these really large images without having to resize them down because that would lose some of the detail and some of the precision. The second problem was determining the minimal amount of data required to train a robust model. I wanted to be able to detect clams in a wide variety of environmental conditions, and it's a bit uncertain how much data you need to do that. And then finally, in this field, I found that a lot of research would just stop at the completion of an algorithm without really pushing it forward to the next step and being able to extract that information to make user-friendly maps or nice visual data. So before we begin building the algorithms, making them very robust, we just have this first issue. And the issue is that the images are very, very large. And the algorithm essentially needs smaller portions of it to be able to run it through. And so usually something that's done is you'll tile the images in these little squares. But another problem that comes with that is that if you tile an image right on an object and that object straddles the boundaries between both images, then you can actually have that object be counted twice by the algorithm, which is not what we want. It's not very accurate. So to kind of work around that, we can use something like this sliding window that will go across and kind of overlap on different sections. But as you can imagine, the detections would get counted twice sometimes, or they'd overlap. So what we would do then is perform a non-maximum suppression, which is just a fancy statistical term of saying that you're going to delete the lower bounding boxes that are overlapped. So fortunate for me, after quite a lot of research and fine-tuning, I found a GitHub repository called Sahi, which kind of does just that. And I was able to use that on my code with quite a bit of fine-tuning. And just with a very early algorithm, I'll show you this image, which is a section of an orthomosaic. And you can see I was able to detect all the live clams. I wasn't interested in the dead ones. And you can see that all the clams were nicely detected without being split in half sometimes. So I was really proud of this. This was quite the hurrah moment when it worked. So problem one is solved. I'm able to apply the algorithm to very large images. And now we move on to the next part of my work, which was the main bulk of it. And the objective was to train the most robust algorithm while trying to spend the least amount of time labeling training data, which can be by far the most tedious and long process, where you just have to feed images and label bounding boxes around the images that around the object, sorry, that you're trying to detect. And I wanted to see what the minimal amount of labeling was to produce an algorithm that was capable of detecting clams where it wasn't trained on that imagery. So I'll show you afterwards, it'll be a bit more clear. For the training data, I have to be totally honest with you. Part of the reason I also chose clams as my case study was because we had multiple orthomosaics of a clam garden at Orpheus Islands. I used this as my training data. And this imagery would prove really, really valuable to train my algorithm, as there were multiple orthomosaics that were captured under a variety of different environmental conditions. And this would really help the model kind of train on be able to pick up on clams through different tides or water turbidity or surface wind conditions. So here we can just see 3 different screenshots of these clam gardens, and you can see at the bottom the clams, which are the same ones, but they're very, very different looking from one to another. And although this imagery doesn't represent clams in the wild and clam densities in the wild, that wasn't really much of a concern for me, because all I wanted was really to have the most amount of clams that I can label for my algorithm. It didn't matter that in the wild they're not aggregated like this. So once I labeled my data, I applied different augmentations to my images. This is a really helpful tool because it allows us to generate more data to the algorithm without actually having to label it. And there's dozens and dozens of augmentations that exist. And for this research, I just decided to apply 4. I put the flip, I added different hues, a blur effect, and brightnesses, and I thought that would enhance the algorithm's capability to detect the clams in different conditions. Sometimes the water may be a bit more blue, or if it's a bit deeper, it'll be a bit more blurry. At this point, it's really up to the user to decide which augmentations he wants or she wants to apply and which best fits for their model. As I began building bigger and bigger data sets, I trained algorithms at each step of the way, making them more and more complex on the data. So at first, I just I labeled 100 images and just trained it on those 100 images, which were from my best imagery. Then I added some augmentations. I also resized them to have different input sizes. And then I added the other orthomosaics from that same clam garden. And at the very end, I also decided to add null imagery from the reef to train it to not detect sometimes corals as clams, or to not have as many false positives. Each model was trained using Yellow v5. This is a state-of-the-art object detection model designed for real-time performance. I chose this model because it's really good as an off-the-shelf solution. It's quite quick and easy to deploy, especially if you're not super well-versed in computer sciences and things like that, which I wasn't when I began this. So it doesn't require any difficult architecture customizations, which can be quite complex. And to see whether my algorithm was successful, I tested on 3 different orthomosaics from the Great Barrier Reef. And I wanted to see if the algorithm would be able to pick up on the clams in different environmental conditions. So these are the 3 other reefs that I tested the algorithm on. Here are some of the clams, and keep in mind that this imagery wasn't trained on any of this. So here are my results. It's not super informative, is it? In a lot of research and a lot of papers, MAP means mean average precision, and it's one of the metrics that's given to give the algorithms how good it is. I find it quite difficult to visualize and to understand if it's good. So I made this little graph. And so you can see for models 1, 4, 6, and 13, those at the top are pictures of the different clams from the testing reefs, and the number associated in each column is at which confidence it was detected. And so what we really want are those pink cases where it detected it at higher than 80%. And we can see that for model 13, which was trained on about 600 labeled data, that it started to do fairly well for that. So now we kind of know. Another thing to keep in mind is that for a lot of these algorithms, you also have to be careful to see how many false positives. So we can see for model 6, while the mean average precision was really high, it sometimes would detect a big piece of coral or just a dark shadow as a clam. So we don't want that. We have to be very mindful of that. So problem 2 is more or less solved. We can see that with about just 600 labeled images, we're able to make a robust algorithm. And now we're at our final problem, which most people don't go through the process of doing, is that I want to extract the information from my model to be able to create a beautiful map. The only problem is that the detections are referenced within the image coordinates and not geospatial ones. So how do we translate a pixel XY into a point longitude and latitude? To do so, it was fairly straightforward, just a lot of Python finagling. You'd first extract the labels, which were referenced in your XY coordinates. And then I used this library called raster.io that would pair that with the information from the TIFF files. From that, I would get a latitude and longitude points from those, import those into ArcGIS and display as XY. And this was really nice now because you had your attributes table with all of your information and then your points from those. And then you can make these nice and beautiful density maps. So problem 3 is solved, able to make nice maps. And congratulations, you didn't have to spend a whole afternoon sitting down to count 1,200 clams on your own, or to go through hectares and hectares of reef imagery to just spot 3 clams and not know if you've missed any or whatnot. So that's my research. Thank you.
So, from those in the room, do we have any questions for our presenters tonight?
Yes.
Kick off with Gavin.
Okay. Question for all 3 of you. What next?
Big question. That is, yeah, constantly in the search for a job, I suppose.
like an academic?
Yeah, so the next step for me is trying to branch out a little bit more and do some more remote sensing, like what the other guys have been speaking about here, to try and automate what we've been doing over a larger scale. So a lot of what I've been doing has been sorting through individual images and georeferencing them and drawing shorelines, which is great, and the images are really good. But if we can try and automate that and do it a little bit quicker, that will also be very good. So we're doing that. We're also, the wave models that we've been using, we've been refining them and extending them to be more accurate, especially across the Great Barrier Reef. So the past year, I've just been only working on that. We're finally at a point now where it works quite well with what we've been doing. So we've created a new wave model that's made of triangles. So it's made of 9.5 million triangles across the entire Great Barrier Reef. So the model runs nice and smoothly, and we can account for all of the complexity within all those reefs and channels. So we can get more accurate waves at the coast. That's what I've been doing, and that's kind of still in the process, and we're improving on that as we move forward, I guess. So that's me.
Okay.
Hopefully finish my PhD. But before I do that, you might have noticed on one of the slides, my thesis question was basically, is there more species richness? And the second key question was actually endemism, and John's helping with that. But basically, endemism is how restricted a species is. So we have this hypothesis that because those volcanoes are raised in elevation, and in the past we would have had glacial and interglacial cycles, and these species would have probably retracted into these highland areas, and then they become restricted, and then competition around them becomes really hard, and then they're just stuck on these mountain tops. And I wanted to know, is that true? Because some people have just hypothesized and done a lot of waving with their arms. So right now what I'm doing is looking at endemism and trying to see, is that really the case? How restricted are they? And then once that's done, hopefully I'll be starting a cadetship at the Department of Environmental Science. And that will be more in remote sensing. So we're looking at LiDAR data to try to classify different types of forests, so then we can predict species richness from space.
The Queensland Department of Environment.
Perfect. And lastly,
What's next for me? Oh, same thing, try and write this up, get it published, finish my master's. But I also really want to try and make an open source, almost kind of a recipe for conservationists and other people to go through a workflow to be kind of, to do exactly what I've done with clams, but with whichever species they're looking at. I just know from the outside and when I began doing this, everything that revolved around AI or machine learning and all those things were quite complex and quite scary. But when you dive into it, if you have an easy workflow, it's actually really simple and such a helpful tool. So I'm just trying to find a way afterwards to have something open source and open access that anybody can use and work through to help use these tools for them.
perfect. Next question. Giselle.
What's the most satisfying or like satisfying discovery, like the thing that's kind of piqued your curiosity? You're like, huh, I wasn't expecting that while you've been doing the research.
Yeah. So when I first started doing a PhD, we sort of had an idea of what we were drawing all these shorelines, and we're like, oh, we'll see erosion. It'll be, that'll be pretty standard, but we'll quantify it at least. And when we finished drawing all the shorelines and I digitized everything, we were looking at it and going, we don't see any erosion. So what's going on here? So that sort of shaped the rest of what I decided to do for the rest of my PhD. Things changed a little bit from there on. COVID definitely helped with that as well. But and that sort of has shaped what I've been doing from that point onwards as well. So we're still investigating some of those things. We're looking to new methods to try and see if we can spot some of these things in different locations as well. So, yeah.
For me, it would be the basaltic material wasn't as species rich as everybody said it would be. There's a lot of literature from the last 50 years or so that basically that hypothesizes that the basalt is where there's a lot of nutrients and therefore there should be high number of species there. And that's why, as soon as they arrived in Australia, they cleared it for agriculture. But when I look at remnant forests where there are forests that have been protected, because all of this is in protected areas, and when I look at the number of species, it doesn't stack up compared to the felsic material or the other non-volcanic sites. It's just not as species rich as we hypothesized.
When you say it's not, oh sorry, do you mean for just vascular plants or
for just vascular?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I think what surprised me the most was from my testing, the reefs that I tested the algorithm on. I knew I'd looked at the reef prior and had spotted one or two big clams, so I knew they were there. But what really surprised me was the more I developed complex or robust algorithms, sometimes the algorithm would pick up on a clam that was tucked away in a corner that I hadn't seen at all. And I was like, wow, like I definitely haven't spotted that. So it definitely works pretty well. That was quite surprising.
Do we have any more questions for anyone online? Anyone here in the audience with us tonight? Up the back.
Got a question, Olivier. So I was just wondering, does your algorithm, would that work with video footage as well as just photos?
So YOLO does work with video footage. I think it has to be the maximum is 60 frames per second. It definitely does work. It depends again if it all depends on the training, like on the images or the training data that you give it. Are you going to find that information in the video that you're giving it as well? So if I flew a drone, I guess at the same altitude over the reef, it probably could spot and track the clams in that sense. But if I took this algorithm that I made and you went underwater with a GoPro and just went over and filming it, it probably wouldn't work. But you definitely can do. YOLO was one of the first algorithms that was able to do object detection in real time, which was really, really helpful and useful.
How much more complex would it be to classify moving objects? So we've seen, I've seen turtles being floating around, and then people have flown drones over it, and then it's actively counted the number of turtles in that little cluster. Is it a lot more work?
I don't think it is. Anytime you have anything moving, the only thing that's complex, I guess, is yeah, how do you make sure that as you're moving, that turtle you counted one time is the same turtle or not the same turtle that the next frame is counting? I don't know specifically how that works. I really didn't play around with videos at all. I mainly did stills and had to deal with, first of all, how do you put these massive images into these little tiles and everything, and when that worked, I was really happy already. So I haven't played around with videos yet, unfortunately. But what I really like about the orthomosaics, though, is that if you're just flying a drone and counting these turtles, you know how many turtles they are, but you don't really know where they are, how they're separated, or spatially from one year to another. It's kind of difficult to do like these density maps or whatnot. I find having an orthomosaic, you can kind of derive more information out of it in that sense.
Down the front.
Are you aware of comparative types of studies from different parts of the world in your area?
Yeah, so one thing that was relatively recently over the past couple of years, in terms of my things at least, what we were tracking in terms of shorelines, we tracked the vegetation line that we can see quite well, and the shoreline at the coast. So we can see both of those things. So again, an idea of the shape of the beach. But what we noticed, and what some other researchers had published in recent years as well, that they noticed similar things. So accretion in places when they're looking at the vegetation line there. So it just seems there's been a lot of growth of trees over the past 100 years. So maybe not related to sediment in some places, but that is something we've noticed as well. So similar sort of studies are looking at those. But there has been more advancement in terms of automatically detecting shorelines and doing those sorts of things as well. So it's sort of an evolving field, I think. So.
Did you use any of the DEA coastlines data to inform your investigation?
Yeah, so I was talking to Robbie about it a couple of weeks ago, but because I provided him with some of the shorelines we had, so he could get calibrating all the new shorelines. But we used DEA coastlines in some of the more recent work we've done to try and compare it with the aerial photos we had and see if we could compare and see similar trends. They are tracking a different kind of thing. They're tracking mean sea level rather than vegetation line and the shoreline, but we can see some similar trends. They do see erosion more in places because they're just tracking that mean sea level rather than the vegetation line or anything else. So slightly different things, but yeah, it's an interesting data set to see. So, yeah.
For those not aware, DA Coastlines is a project out of Geoscience Australia where they've taken the Landsat and Sentinel-2 stacks and then run an algorithm pretty much drawing a contour line midway through pixels to approximate where the shoreline was, and using the dense time series and knowing tide times, sort of figure out what that means sea level was through time. They've just released their next generation of data up online, so you can explore that today. Annie, sorry.
I was gonna ask you, Dylan, how did you standardize the imagery with the tides?
Yeah, good question. So
from year to year.
A lot of the imagery that we had did have times on them, so they've got dates and times. Some of them didn't have times, or the times on them we couldn't quite read them for some of the older images. But for the ones that we had the times on, we could try and account for the tides because they're relatively easy to sort of hindcast, or we just actually have tide gauges nearby that we can use. The ones where we didn't have the times for, we just had dates, we just applied sort of a general correction based on the area that it's in, based on the tide gauges that are nearby. So luckily we do have a lot of tide gauges with water level information for the past 30 odd years. So we did have a pretty decent idea of what was going on in terms of that shoreline, but that's why we drew the vegetation line as well. So it doesn't have the influence of the tides on that. So the long-term trends we see in the position of the tree line is a little bit more accurate. And if we see progradation of the trees over 100 years, we're confident that that's actually progradation rather than just the movement of the tides over one day. So that's where it differs from DEA as well. Just going back to that, that's not as good in places that are pulling out the tidal signal. So in places like Mackay, we've got a bit of trouble pulling that kind of signal out. So, yeah.
Back on our question of other studies. Annie?
Oh, other comparative studies? Yes. So there are two other studies. There's one in the US. So if you know, I think it's called Yellowstone National Park. So that's a huge hotspot, but it's a much shorter track. So my track goes over 2,000 kilometers, whereas the one in the US is about half of that. And the other volcanic hotspot track is in Africa. And then there's a whole bunch of islands as well. So we've got, you've got your Hawaiian Islands, you've got I think it's the Canary Islands. So there are about 40 to 50 hotspots identified.
And have they done studies, anything like what you've done?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah. So I think what they've done, particularly in the US and in the African hotspots, they're more interested in the geology aspect of it, and nobody's just sat around and actually looked at the trees. Yeah.
And online.
I don't know about there. I mean, it's not much of a study. It's more of a methods for me. And there's hundreds of papers that have used AIs to detect their objects of interest. But I really wanted to do this. And what I really wanted to push was, how do you extract that information and use that information? And in a lot of these studies, I really found that they'd say, we created this algorithm that was able to detect these things with a mean average precision of 90%. And I'm like, that doesn't mean anything. Like it doesn't mean much to me, because is it going to be able to see it in a low light situation? Is it going to be able to see it in a cloudy situation or whatever? So I wanted to kind of open that field a bit more and kind of push that and be like, well, how can we present this information to really see how good it is? And then also, not a lot of, I've only found, I think, 2 other papers that actually extract the information to have georeferencing of it. And the same thing with the orthomosaics. A lot of them just use the tiles. That new library that does the sliding window is quite a fairly new thing. So a lot of old research or past research would kind of work around it, and they'd actually go back and manually count the objects that are on the borders and straddling, which is just more work for you to do. So that's kind of where it's at.
Perfect. Do we have any final questions looking at the time?
Yeah,
Oh.
just a question on the shoreline. You showed a slide of Marucci, the mouth of Marucci, 1974. That was pretty phenomenal weather-wise here in Queensland, southeast Queensland, especially with the cyclones and rain events. So that the shifting of the mouth, I don't know what month in 74 that the photo was taken.
It was about June, that one in 74.
June?
It might be a bit later though, I can't remember exactly.
But
So
that the mouth might have been opened up with the whoosh of water coming down. But then the next one showed the repair.
yes.
So there's the natural appreciation of the sands.
That's actually, it's one thing we don't capture sometimes with the older imagery is the frequency of these things. So if something is like the images I showed for Flinders, if something is eroded in November and then comes back in April, sometimes we don't capture that with the older photos because we might have one every year, every couple of years, or one every decade or something like that. So, but it does give us an idea of what things would look like, but it is just a snapshot. But I think most of the photos were taken sort of winter time.
Yeah,
so
winter's the Queensland fire season.
Yeah, so that's a little bit more consistent. It's sort of the calmer season here. So it's more representative of what we would see sort of in normal conditions rather than just off the back of a cyclone or something like that. But it doesn't discount sort of storms occurring in wintertime, which we do get, of course. But, yeah.
But we had heavy rain December, January.
Yeah.
And then, it would have taken a while to kind of filter it in from the land to create that mouth. And maybe it was a deeper gorge and took quite a while to.
Yeah, it's like the Bribie Island breakthrough at the moment as well, that one. So one storm comes through and now it's all changed. So and whether that goes back, because it has been like that in the past. Bulcock Beach at the south of Caloundra has been quite large in the past, and the mouth of sort of the entrance there at Top Palmstone Passage has been where it is now. So it does kind of vary up and down a bit. But over what timescale, we're not exactly sure. So,
building in the variation.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So
Perfect. If we have nothing final, yeah,
One more,
go for it.
Olivier. I was wondering if you actually had a set height for where your drone had to take the photos, when you were taking the photos for those clams.
That's a really good question. I haven't, that's one thing I do plan on doing as well, is seeing how far I can push it. Most of the imagery I had was at 20-meter height. And then there's some that were a bit lower at like 9 meters and then 30 meters. So it would be interesting to see how far up of a drone you could fly for it to still be able to count it. One thing that I did do again is I cropped different sizes of images, but all fed them into the same size image. So most of these images would be reduced down. So if you had a big clam, sort of, it would be smaller, which would make it that in a higher altitude drone, it would still be able to detect that small clam. But especially in marine environments, it's really hard to get good drone data, just because if there's any wind, you've got ripples on the surface. If there's any current, you've got stuff floating in the water. The sun at which time you're flying your drone can have a big glint and a big glare on the sea surface. So it's definitely interesting to also maybe afterwards see and push how far this model is good for imagery that's a bit too deep or a drone a bit too high. So, but yeah, most of this imagery was at around 20 meters with a ground sampling distance. I think 1 pixel was about like 3 centimeters or 4 centimeters. So it's very fine. It's very fine imagery.
And I'm assuming all the imagery is on GeoNadir.
Yeah, plug for GeoNadir. It's a really, really good open source database where you can put drone imagery on.
Perfect. Well, if we've got no further questions, we'll wrap up there and thank all of our fantastic presenters.